Hello and welcome to this installment of Vox Machina. As your narrator, I'll be bringing fantastic works of fiction from the page to your eardrums. Uploads will be posted weekly, so be sure to subscribe and hit the alerts bell to be notified when new installments are available. Got a story you think deserves the Vox Machina treatment? Let me know in a comment and you might just hear it in a future episode. Thanks for listening and on with the show. How to Train Your Malfoy by Fencer X. Episode 2. When Harry awoke the next morning, he was roused not by the bright warm sunlight streaming in through his thin bedroom curtains, nor by his garden gnome's vibrant cursing as he chased off what sounded like a massive slug that had been threatening to topple one of the tomato plants, but to a firm, solid body pressed tight against his own, one arm thrown over Harry's chest and soft, tickling breaths washing slowly over his neck with the steady rhythm of deep, comfortable slumber. Harry's eyes popped open and he blinked up at the ceiling once, twice, 3 times, testing his senses just to be sure he wasn't imagining the aforementioned firm, solid body, arm over his chest and soft breathing against his neck. Nope, it was still there even once the cobwebs of sleep had been swept away, and cocking his head just to the side, careful and cautious, he found his nose pressed against the crown of a head of lank blonde hair that smelled rather musty, like it hadn't been washed in ages. What the fuck? Harry rolled off the side of the mattress in his best impression of a seasoned aura dodging a deadly curse, collapsing onto the floor in a pile of limbs and groping desperately for his wand. His mindless flailing knocked his wand from its stand on his bedside table, and it nearly rolled under the bed before he managed to nab it, stumbling to his feet and whirling around as he backed his way out of the room, wand trained on the trespasser in his bed. A very, very nude, and definitely not dead, not even unconscious, not anymore, Draco fucking Malfoy. What the fuck are you doing in my bed? More to the point, what was he doing in his room, even? Hermione had always had better marks than Harry in school, but he'd been pretty sure he could handle a proper locking spell inside his own home. How had Malfoy escaped? When had Malfoy escaped? Hermione had assured him Malfoy had been under so strong a curse even she couldn't wake him up. And yet, here he was, shifting blearily upright as he rubbed the sleep from his eyes and glancing around with a frown as he struggled to get his bearings. Harry stamped a foot, arm thrust forward and wand brandished. Answer me. What? How did you... Fuck! He wished he'd had the forethought to grab his glasses as well in his mad dash to escape Malfoy's groping grasp, but he didn't dare show a hint of weakness, not while Malfoy was sitting there with his everything out, so he'd just have to hope he could hit the broadside of a barn if it came to it. But Malfoy seemed in no great rush to answer Harry's question, nor did he seem terribly intimidated by Harry's wand raised in threat. Quite the contrary, when his eye fell on Harry, he seemed to connect that Harry was, in fact, no longer curled up next to him, and pouted. It was the only word Harry could summon to describe the expression. He seemed positively put out that he was now alone in Harry's bed, and he shifted forward onto hands and knees, carefully crawling on shaky limbs towards Harry. Harry didn't like that, not one bit. He tightened his grip on his wand. I'm warning you, Malfoy, stay back! He didn't want Malfoy's bare bum and other assorted nether regions rubbing all over his freshly laundered sheets, but it was better than the alternative. I don't want to have to put you into the wall, but I will. Don't think I won't. I'm sure your mind's a bit addled, but I'm willing to bet force is a language you can comprehend even in your current state. He squinted. It was impossible to tell Malfoy's expression without his glasses. Do you even understand me? There was no response, and Malfoy did not heed his warning, still creeping closer as he slid off the bed and onto unsteady feet, and Harry had to grope behind himself with his free hand to open the door. Damn it, stop! Oh, I don't know, heal! Stay? Oh, bollocks! With a quiet, private apology, because surely Malfoy wasn't in his right mind, and it felt a bit unfair to put him on his arse first thing in the morning, Harry sliced his wand through the air and delivered a resounding knockback jinx, which slammed hard into Malfoy's chest, and made contact with a shield of glittering black scales that seemed to absorb the magic before flaking away to nothing, leaving Malfoy entirely unblemished and very much unknocked back. How the hell did you... Harry muttered to himself, then quickly fixed his gaze back on Malfoy. It was less than wise to take his attention from what, if Hermione had the right of it, was a very angry mad dragon in a pasty-faced kid's body. But Malfoy did not seem to be stalking him. nor did Harry catch any glint of animalistic predatory hunger in those bright grey eyes. He followed, didn't chase, at a reasonably sedate pace, matching Harry's own as he struggled to put distance between himself and Malfoy. It was like Harry was leading him. Curiously, this did not bring any degree of relief to their interactions. The backs of his thighs bumped up against his armchair, and Harry narrowly avoided toppling backward. This seemed to be the moment Malfoy had been waiting for as he closed the remaining distance between himself and Harry startlingly quickly. Harry yelped, delivering a reflexive Petrificus Totalis, but just as Malfoy had quite literally brushed off the knockback jinx, so too did the body bind fail to find its mark, slamming up against a carpet of black scales that seemed to manifest over Malfoy's chest from nothing, dissipating the magic and flaking away into sparkling bits of dust. Nothing for it, Harry rolled himself backwards and over the armchair and then raced for the kitchen, whirling around once he'd crossed the threshold and shouting, "Protego!" A translucent, cool blue barrier filled the jam, radiating waves of abjurative magical energy, and Harry sank into one of his dinette chairs, breathing hard. Just beyond the barrier, Malfoy stood, disgustingly tall and still distressingly nude, brushing questing fingers over the surface of the barricade and sending magical echoes rippling over it as he stared at it with a curious frown, momentarily distracted from further attempts to accost Harry. Fuck, this was bad. Sure, maybe Malfoy wasn't so much mad as confused, but that did nothing to mitigate the problem of him now being alive and alert and here, in Harry's house, with no one around to help manage him. He was, as Hermione had put it, essentially a dragon in a human's body, and Harry didn't have a stellar track record when it came to tangling with dragons. Could he owl Charlie, he wondered? But no, Hermione had sworn him to secrecy, and what advice was Charlie likely to reasonably offer when Harry asked him what he ought to do with a dragon trapped in his sitting room? Feed it lots of biscuits? Malfoy was still fussing with the barrier, and his brows furrowed just a tick, an elegant little divot forming between them as he seemed to focus intently. And Harry watched, dumbfounded, as his fingertips blackened like he'd just dipped them in soot, and his grimy, stubby fingernails began to lengthen, arching into wickedly curved talons. He pawed at the shield charm, and to Harry's horror, managed to work one of his taloned nails in between the microscopic magical threads that kept the barrier sound, tugging at it in an obvious effort to tear through it. Harry immediately leapt to his feet, waving his hands. "Stop that! Cut it out! No! Bad dragon!" God, he felt ridiculous, but Malfoy did at least stop messing with the threads, though his nails remained wicked black talons, tapping absently against the shield. He fixed his attention on Harry once more, and Harry knew he had to hold it, or else Malfoy would go back to attempting to dismantle the Protego. How the hell was he doing that? And Harry would be on the run again. He took a tentative step forward, hands raised, though he kept his wand up his sleeve for easy access. Can you understand me? Can you, nod or something? Give me some kind of sign I'm not just talking to myself here? Alas, there was nothing. Only curious eyes tracking him. Harry's shoulders slumped. Oh, shit. What the hell am I supposed to do with you? He couldn't stay locked behind the barrier forever, not least of all because eventually Malfoy would manage to tear a hole through it, and, well, he didn't want to contemplate what Malfoy might do at that point. Turning into a great fire-breathing beast and eating Harry might be the kindest outcome. One thing he did know, this was well outside his wheelhouse. It was time to call in Hermione to take care of her little pet project. Harry would help her find somewhere else to hide Malfoy, but he wasn't staying here. He summoned his Patronus, and though Malfoy flinched at first when it appeared in a burst of silvery mist, he quickly pressed himself up against the Protego like a kid at Christmas who just spotted the new top-of-the-line broomstick floating in the window of quality Quidditch supplies, eyeing the stag hungrily. Harry didn't want to dwell overlong on what that meant, and he promptly sent it on its way, reminding it to seek out Ron and let him know Harry really needed to speak with Hermione as soon as possible, for Sleeping Beauty was awake. Malfoy deflated a bit when the Patronus disappeared off to deliver its message, and Harry grumped, "You'd better not eat my Patronus. You'll eat people food while you're here, right? Hey!" He snapped his fingers for Malfoy's attention, and those sharp grey eyes were fixed on him once more. "If I drop this shield charm, you aren't gonna, invade my very hard-fought personal space, are you?" But Malfoy was tapping insistently against the barrier again, and Harry sighed, maneuvering around behind one of the chairs and grabbing hold of it, ready to use it to fend off Malfoy's advances like a lion tamer. "Don't make me regret this." He palmed his wand and with a quick snapping movement dispelled the barrier. Malfoy, clearly not expecting this, promptly toppled forward, landing hard on his hands and knees. Harry winced, taking a preemptive step back in case Malfoy mistook this for a cruel joke, which, under different circumstances, it could well have been. But Malfoy only groaned pitiably and struggled back to his feet, evidently still unsteady on his atrophied limbs. "I would have warned you, but I doubt you'd have understood," Harry said, and Malfoy shook his head, slowly taking in his new surroundings, and then realized there was nothing stopping him from advancing on Harry again. Ah! Harry warned, giving the chair between them a good threatening shake. "You can stay right where you are." This did not seem to translate, for Malfoy continued his approach, and with a soft fuck of frustration, Harry shoved the chair toward him, when a flash of silver caught his eye as a glowing Jack Russell Terrier bounded through the wall and into view. Malfoy was instantly distracted, whirling around with preternatural speed, and with startling reflexes he pounced on the Patronus as it opened its mouth, Ron's voice emanating in a clear tone. "Hermione's at work. I'll pass on the message, but I doubt she'll be able to get away before the weekend. Sympathies, mate. I've got stalking duty, else I'd help." Harry very much doubted Ron's sympathies were all that sincere. Better Harry be stuck here with Malfoy in his addled state than him, he was likely thinking. Harry honestly couldn't blame him. Still, he wished Ron were here for an assortment of reasons, starting with wrangling Malfoy and ending with pouring each other very strong drinks while they commiserated over Hermione keeping such a massive secret from the both of them. It felt like third year all over again. Malfoy was now madly stamping on the floor and causing things to bounce as he did so, evidently attempting to dispel the Patronus, and each blow of his foot through its glittering body sent puffs of silvery magical energy scattering. With its message delivered, the Patronus finally vanished, and Malfoy must have taken this as a sign of a successful eradication on his part, for he puffed out his pale, bony chest with pride and gave a little yip of accomplishment, beaming widely at Harry. Harry rubbed his face. Yeah, great job. You sure showed it." No longer particularly caring if Malfoy assaulted him or not, he slumped into the chair he'd just been brandishing at Malfoy and groaned. So he was stuck here, until at least the weekend, with a Malfoy who seemed more animal than human and shrugged off spells with nary a second thought. Just perfect. Fantastic, even. Voldemort would be rolling over in his grave at not getting to do in Harry himself, but at least a Death Eater would land the final blow. Except Harry squinted at Malfoy, who was presently stalking the whole 10 square meters of the kitchen, presumably searching for more Patronuses horning in on his territory or something, and realized that his left forearm showed no signs of the inky blotch of the dark mark. More to the point, now that he actually looked, leaning so far back he nearly fell out of the chair, Malfoy's chest also no longer bore the horrific silvery scars left over from their brief, doomed interaction in the sixth-floor boys' bathroom. Every inch of him, and there were several inches of him, seemed fresh and unmarred. His knees didn't even seem bruised from his earlier tumble. Harry hung his head. What the hell was he? This wasn't animagecraft. It couldn't be. He'd met a fair few animagi in his days now, and none of them had ever had their better halves so forcefully manifest while they were human. Sure, sometimes Sirius had watched the squirrels running around the back garden of number 12 a little too longingly, and Pettigrew and their very brief interactions had always seemed a bit hunched, like he didn't like being so exposed out in the open. But that wasn't this. That wasn't having your entire personality, such as it was, shunted aside with an animal plopped down in its place. That wasn't bits and pieces of said animal manifesting as it pleased, in scaly protective shields and ripping talons and fantastically rapid magical recovery. A pair of knobby bare feet stepped into his eye line, wiggling reflexively. Harry froze. He didn't dare raise his head, wary of what might be sitting just at eye level if he did so. He placed his hands, carefully, gently, lest Malfoy interpret this as an assault on his person and tear his arms off, on Malfoy's hips, and guided him back as Harry closed his eyes tight and straightened upright. When he dared open them again, he found himself staring, to his consternation, at the bridge of Malfoy's nose, just below his eyeline. Years of malnutrition and being forced to live in tight quarters had done a number on Harry's build. Why couldn't the same have held true for Malfoy? Life truly was not fair. He sighed. Right, let's at least get you some clothes. I can't deal with you like this. There was just no winning an argument, even against a mute person, when they were nude and you were not. It lent them a kind of paradoxical power, like they were so beyond caring about what they looked like you couldn't hope to bother them. Malfoy looked thoroughly unbotherable right about now, and Harry was having none of that. He made for his wardrobe, digging through the chaos that made up the bottommost drawer until he found the bag he'd thrown Ron's clothes into after they'd been left behind the previous summer when Ron and Hermione had come up to spend a few weeks just before the back-to-school rush hit the Weasley shops. He held up a faded orange shirt that proclaimed in loud, bold lettering, "This year for sure." It had not, in fact, been that year, and supposed Malfoy was in no position to complain about the colour or the cannons. Getting the shirt onto Malfoy, though, was another matter entirely, as he didn't seem to understand even the most basic of instructions, and fought Harry every time he tried to wrangle the clothing onto him. Eventually, he just resorted to a placement charm, praying Malfoy wouldn't shake this one off too, and for a brief shining moment it seemed to work. Malfoy was still naked from the waist down, but everything above board looked dandy. Until Malfoy glanced down at himself with a disgusted frown, raised a hand and unsheathed those nasty talons once more, raking them across his chest and absolutely shredding to ribbons Ron's poor Cannon's 2000 World Cup run commemorative tee. "Oh, for fuck's sake, don't... Oh, God damn it, why did you..." Harry buried both hands in his hair and tugged hard in frustration. "Why is it you somehow manage to piss me off just as much when you're a mindless lizard as when you're a proper human being? Not that you ever were a proper human being, if we're being honest." Perhaps the orange really had still offended him, somewhere deep down. Harry turned back to the wardrobe and began rooting around again, certain there'd been a pair of joggers left behind too. A nice, boring grey colour that would look lovely on Malfoy's bottom half, covering up his anything and everything. In retrospect, Harry probably should have started there and worked his way up to t-shirts and pullovers. But when he finally managed to dig out the joggers, he turned around to see Malfoy already clutching in his grasp one of Harry's older and rattier Weasley jumpers. It had holes under both arms and the hem was fraying, but he couldn't bring himself to toss it, convinced that one of these days he was going to bring it back to Molly and ask her to mend it so it could see many more years of service. Sure, he had about 10 of these jumpers now, but each one was special, and he very much did not want this one shredded like Ron's hapless Cannon's tee. No, that one's mine, if you could just..." He carefully, ever so carefully, tried to gently tug it from Malfoy's grasp. But to his great shock, the talons that had replaced Malfoy's nails slowly retracted, leaving behind perfectly reasonable, if a bit grimy and ill-serviced, nail beds. Malfoy balled up the jumper, then buried his face in it, taking a great deep lungful. Harry grimaced. The jumper was clean, but it had to have been years since he'd last seen a Tergo, and even from here he could smell the mustiness roiling off of it. Why Malfoy would want to go and suck in a lungful of that stench was beyond Harry. Dragons were weird. But the weirdness wasn't over, for now Malfoy was trying to crawl inside the jumper. No, he was trying to wear it, except he was starting with the neck hole, and bollocks, he was going to stretch it out beyond Harry's limited ability to mend. He scrambled to help Malfoy orientate himself properly if he was truly bent on wearing the jumper. No, it goes on this way, from this end. Yeah, your arm's good. No, not there. There. It was a lucky thing Molly knitted her jumpers a few sizes larger than they probably needed to be. Harry had always preferred a looser fit anyway, and once Malfoy had his arms and head in the proper holes, it hung from him decently well. Malfoy seemed much more satisfied with the jumper than he had the tee, and Harry couldn't figure if he was just partial to scarlet or if perhaps he'd been cold. That tended to happen when you ran around naked, even in mid-June. Malfoy pulled up the cabled collar to cover his nose and gave more testing sniffs, and Harry turned back to the wardrobe, fishing out the joggers he'd dropped in a panic. Top down, bottoms to go. But Malfoy treated the sensible grey joggers with just as much disdain as he had the orange tee, slicing them up 6 ways to Sunday, and Harry began to form a new hypothesis. Malfoy just wanted to wear his clothes. This theory gained further support when Harry found an old pair of pyjama bottoms he was comfortable never wearing again. He would always know that Malfoy's bollocks had been rubbing all up against the fabric, even once they'd been thoroughly scourgified, and Malfoy obediently let Harry show him how to step into them. They rode high, the cuffs barely reaching Malfoy's ankles, but he didn't seem to mind this one bit. crouching into a little ball once they'd been tied off and burying his face into his knees, giving another deep, bracing sniff. Harry amended his earlier thought. Dragons were really, really weird. He let Malfoy have his moment, then tugged on the jumper to get him back on his feet. Come on, up you get. I'm not leaving you in here alone with the rest of my clothes. I don't want to know what you'll do to them. Probably make a nest or something. Did dragons make nests? He wasn't keen to find out. Malfoy complied, shifting uncomfortably close to Harry, and Harry raised his hands, bracing between them to force Malfoy to leave a bit of breathing room. It took a decent shove, but he did allow himself to be pushed back, only frowning in confusion at Harry as he did so, like a toddler who didn't understand why he couldn't live 24/7 in his parents' personal space. Harry froze, though, with his palms splayed over Malfoy's chest. The jumper gaped a bit, given how underfed Malfoy was, exposing his collarbone and offering a cheeky peek at a smooth, unblemished pectoral just below it. Yep, still no crisscrossing web of scars, and it was strange how it unsettled him more that they weren't there than if they had been. Something else of Malfoy's that had been stripped away, probably for the better, like the dark mark, but there was value in scars. They reminded you of things you were better off not forgetting. Reminded others of things they maybe wanted to forget. Harry let his hands drop back to his sides, shunting his gaze away from Malfoy's chest. Probably a coward's way out, but I figure when you can't understand me is as good a time as any to apologize. Perhaps he could use this as practice for when he eventually proved himself man enough to say these things to Malfoy's face. I didn't know what the curse did, which is probably all the more reason I shouldn't have cast it, I guess, but, well, in fairness, you were casting an unforgivable at me, so I was only defending myself. Just, I'm not that kind of person. I wouldn't have maimed you, not on purpose. When I thought I'd killed you, I don't think I'd ever been so scared in my entire life. Up to that point, at least. And it was a pretty high bar to clear, me being me. But I know that cursed scars can hurt like a bitch, even after they've healed, so I am sorry. And since you can't tell me to go fuck myself, I guess I'll assume you accept my apology. Something brushed against his forehead, and Harry jerked back. Wait, what are you doing? Malfoy had one hand raised, fingers still extended, and a searching look in his eyes. Harry knocked his hand away, taking another step back, and reached up to feel his scar. Malfoy had been touching his scar. Don't do that, he said. It's weird. At length, Malfoy drew his hand back, forming a little ball with his fist, as if to physically keep himself from indulging in any future urges to touch Harry. The timing was odd, to say the least, given Harry had just been talking about scars. Did Malfoy understand what he was saying, after all? Was he still in there, buried somewhere deep down beneath a dozen layers of animalistic instinct and predatory drive and unfathomable magic? Well, if he was, that was Hermione's problem to solve. Harry just had to make it to Saturday, when Hermione would see there was absolutely no way she could possibly ask him to become housemates with the selfsame knob who made their collective lives living hells, even if he didn't seem to remember all of that just now. Forgiveness had to be earned, not doled out like fizzing Whizbees and sherbet lemons by a doting headmaster. So until Malfoy managed a fair enough "I'm sorry for being an absolute pillock from the moment we met," Harry saw no reason to treat him with any more than the most minimal of courtesies, and that didn't include room and board. Well, perhaps a bit of board. With Malfoy more or less decent, at least as far as clothing went, Harry decided a spot of breakfast was in order. Perhaps Malfoy was only following after Harry because he was hungry, like a stray animal, and with a decent meal in his belly he'd find a warm sunbeam to curl up in and trouble Harry no further. He was able to convince Malfoy to sit at the table and wait, impatiently, for Harry to throw a good English together, and as he stood at the hob, directing the frying pans and cutlery and serving plates, he let his mind wander, contemplating his next move. Malfoy, for however human he might appear on the outside, presently had the mind and instincts of a very wild, very justifiably angry animal, so it was probably best Harry not go out of his way to tick him off. It sounded like he'd killed more than a few Department of Mysteries employees already. God, had he eaten them? And though felled by a dragon would be a pretty awesome way for that biography of his to end, he was hoping to go out with a bit less of a bang after all he'd been through. All he had to do was keep Malfoy from turning into a dragon. That meant no more tossing spells at him willy-nilly. He might interpret it as an attack and defend himself the best way a dragon knew how. Harry didn't know the spell to force an animagus back into their human form, so there was no telling how long it lasted. For all he knew, it was still affecting Malfoy even now, and an errant finite incantatem might free him, allowing him to assume his proper form once more, and that would be the last anyone heard of the boy who was eaten by a dragon. Dragons were intelligent, though, at least as far as Charlie told it. Like most magical creatures, they had a leg up over mindless, mundane animals. They could learn to recognize friend from foe, or at least who they associated with pleasure and who they associated with pain. All Harry had to do was make sure he stayed on Malfoy's good side, and everything would be aces. On the bright side, Malfoy didn't seem like a traumatized mad dragon, more like a naughty puppy who hadn't yet learned to recognize its master and simply needed a bit of training to bring him to heel. Had he been a Krupp, Harry might have found his antics endearing. As it was, he was just grateful Malfoy hadn't tried to piss on anything yet. Not entirely sure how he was meant to entertain Malfoy in their hopefully brief time together, Harry largely left him to his own devices. This, it turned out, was a mistake. Had he told Malfoy to go sit in the garden and watch the tomato plants grow, he might have actually done so. But given leave to do whatever he wanted, so long as he wasn't getting up to any mischief, Malfoy decided what he wanted to do was whatever Harry wanted to do. Malfoy, as a human, had been a very proud person who liked to surround himself with sycophants and yes-men who would tell him at regular intervals how wonderful, how very clever, how handsome he was. Malfoy, as a dragon in a human body, still craved attention on a level that seemed to border on almost raw biological need. He clung to Harry's side as if they had been epoxymes together, refusing to let Harry out of his sight, up to and including nearly tearing the bathroom door off its hinges when Harry stepped away to take a piss. Harry's armchair was no longer his armchair, but their armchair. Once Malfoy tried to curl up alongside Harry, who had been hoping to finish just the broad strokes sometime before the turn of the next millennium. In the end, he'd had to transfigure it into a sofa or else endure Malfoy's bony ass in his lap. It was thoroughly unnerving, Malfoy being so insistent on his attentions, though when he stopped to think about it, he supposed it wasn't all that different from how Malfoy had behaved at school. Harry could only hope that Malfoy would take responsibility for his ridiculous actions once he was back in his right mind, and not promptly sue Harry for something like illegal manhandling of the Malfoy heir. If it wasn't a law already, he'd probably campaign for it to be one. The first order of business, he decided, was to set boundaries and teach Malfoy to respect them. If spells weren't effective in keeping Malfoy in line, after all, Harry was going to have to rely on Malfoy actually being a decent sort and giving Harry his space. And Malfoy did seem to learn quickly enough that Harry's squeal of protest and voice raised in threat when Malfoy tried to join him in the toilet or the tub meant he was not welcome. Still, it was 1 step forward and 3 steps back when it came to these efforts, and try as he might, Harry could not get Malfoy to sleep through the night on the enlarged sofa/bed Harry had made for him. Perhaps it was too uncomfortable for his royal arseness's taste, or perhaps it was something a bit more draconic in nature. They lived in colonies, right? Maybe that was the issue. But Malfoy refused to stay put in the studio, winding up by morning, curled up in Harry's bed once more, hogging the blankets and nestling his face against the nape of Harry's neck. For 3 nights Harry tried to ward him off before, on night 4, he was just too exhausted to care any longer. Malfoy at least didn't snore, and though Harry did not appreciate being snuggled, least of all by someone who'd called his best friends the worst names imaginable, it was only an indignation he needed to endure for just a couple more days. And so, framing this quirk in every draconic reference he could muster, perhaps he was hoarding Harry's blankets, or perhaps he'd imprinted on Harry and was simply playing the lost little gosling to Harry's great gander. He tamped down the urge to physically kick Malfoy out of his bed and determined to get some shut-eye. Perhaps most unnerving in their interactions, though, was Malfoy's inability to speak. Harry supposed it made sense. Dragons weren't known for their loquacious nature, after all. But for one, it just felt wrong sharing space with Malfoy when he wasn't picking apart Harry's appearance or ragging on his choice of friends or starting every other sentence with, "My father will hear about." And for another, it scared the pants off Harry when Malfoy would just appear behind him, soundlessly and signlessly, suddenly there. Malfoy had never been good at sneaking around. It had been child's play stalking him back in school, as Harry recalled it. But suddenly it was like he was slipping through shadow, unnoticed and unremarked until he wanted Harry to see him, but never before. Harry couldn't do much about that second part, other than perhaps tie a bell around Malfoy's neck, and they weren't there, not yet, but he reckoned he could try and resolve the first part. He'd taught Teddy to speak, after all, for very loose definitions of speak that mostly amounted to the single syllable ha, and Malfoy probably had the mental capacity of a toddler right about now, so it tracked. It was day 3 when he finally got Malfoy to settle onto the sofa beside him in the sitting room, explaining, "Right, it's a pain in the ass you not being able to communicate, so we're going to try and get you sorted." Malfoy had shown absolutely no indication he understood this, but Harry was not deterred. If you could teach a Krupp to bark on command, surely a dragon confined to human form was similarly easy to train. He started with Potter first. After all, Malfoy had been spitting his name for nearly a decade, so it should be one of the easiest words for him to reclaim. Should being the operative word, because the syllables just got garbled in Malfoy's mouth whenever he tried, which in itself was progress, to repeat the name. Potter was close enough, but it wasn't quite there. And then Harry had an idea, and they tried Harry instead. Teddy had taken to it immediately, again for very loose definitions of taken to it, so surely even Malfoy could wrap his tongue around it. It took a bit of doing. Malfoy couldn't get over the R sound, and Harry eventually had to reach for Malfoy's hand and place it against his throat so he could feel the vibrations as he spoke. Except then Malfoy began leaning entirely too far into Harry's space, evidently taking this as invitation to touch more, and Harry had to put a stop to that. Eventually Harry accepted success when Malfoy finally managed Harry, for while it wasn't perfect, neither was Malfoy, so this would have to do. But teaching Malfoy to say his name, it turned out, had been a terrible mistake. For one, he would not shut up now that he'd realized that saying the word turned Harry's attention his way. Sometimes he would just sit curled up against Harry in the armchair while Harry read and say Harry, apropos of absolutely nothing, just so Harry would frown at him. Harry became his yes and no, and I really don't want to take a bath, though, and Harry was distressed to find he was learning to interpret the subtle differences in those uses. The weekend could not come quickly enough.